Your reaction to a crisis decides whether you capitalize upon it or become victim to it. Big business knows this and applies rules and tricks to manipulate you to think you're constantly in a crisis, constantly confronting your fear of missing out.
Some serious FOMO.
Ooh, you guys, I have FOMO. What
FOMO?
The desire to control demand spawned tricks like limited time offers to steer your demand the direction they want it to go. Limited time offers create a sense of urgency. The fear of missing out is especially difficult when we're talking about life and death. The COVID crisis supplied billions of dollars worth of experimental gene-altering therapies in a single year due to a demand created by the fear of certain death from a man-made virus. They manipulated the market, creating a demand and then providing the supply. This is especially hard to ignore now that we know the virus wasn't a bat's fault. The NIH funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan. Fear motivates people and animals alike to make all sorts of mistakes. When you're scared, blood flow decreases from your brain's frontal lobe, which is responsible for logical thinking and planning. Just look at the hunting tactics of any predator in the wild. They harass and confuse, surprise and terrify their prey, until they make a mistake, separating from the herd, panicking themselves defenseless. In the same way, governments throughout history have taken predatory advantage of fearful citizens during the crisis of war. It is not a government's job to protect its citizens, it is the citizens' job to protect themselves.
From my cold, dead hands.
In this piece, I will point to examples of this tyrannical behavior throughout history and illustrate how our government, in collusion with big tech and big business, have taken advantage of the war on a virus to repeat history.
Let's do this.
1916 was the last year when income tax didn't exist in Canada. It was first introduced in 1917, during the crisis of World War I. The Canadian government needed to raise funds to support the war effort, and so a temporary income tax was pitched as a fair way to do so. The tax was sold as a measure that would be repealed once the war was over. However, the tax proved to be a reliable source of revenue for the government. So plans to repeal were thrown out, and it was gradually expanded until it was made a permanent fixture of Canada's tax system. If Canadians knew that income tax would become a permanent part of life, they never would have agreed to it. That's why oversteps like this need to be pitched as something temporary.
It'll just be temporary.
Everyone alive today accepts the existence they've been born into. However, I'm sure we've got many great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers who are rolling in their graves for falling for all that temporary talk. The Reichstag fire was a catastrophic event that took place on the night of February 27, 1933, in the German Reichstag building in Berlin. It was the home of the German parliament, and the fire had a significant impact on the political landscape of Germany. The Nazis were involved in the Reichstag fire in several ways. For one, they used the urgency that the crisis created as an opportunity to increase their power and crush their political opponents. A Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested and accused of starting the fire. However, there is significant debate over whether he acted alone or was part of a larger conspiracy. Inevitably, the Nazis blamed the fire on a communist plot to overthrow the government and used it as a pretext to suspend civil liberties and increase their control over the country. The Reichstag fire led to passing the Enabling Act on March 23, 1933, which gave Hitler dictatorial powers and effectively ended democracy in Germany. In a world filled with tempting distractions, it has become direly important to remember our history. Hey, look, a fire turned into World War II. It's absolutely incredible how a well-worded marketing campaign will chip away at the very foundation of one's morality. One of the most recent examples happened after the largest foreign terrorist attack on American soil, 9/11. The Americans used the sense of urgency created by that crisis to justify the temporary measures passed here in North America called
Patriot Act.
The Patriot Act.
Patriot Act. Read it.
This act gave law enforcement sweeping powers to monitor and investigate citizens, often without warrants or probable cause. These are policies that violated civil liberties and human rights and have been renewed year after year. In fact, the Patriot Act is still in place to this day. The Americans may have been comfortable forfeiting their rights for a period of time to allow authorities to figure out what was going on. It seemed like a reasonable temporary measure given what they'd been told happened.
It's just temporary.
It's expected that people will make sacrifices during a crisis, and we should also expect governments to take full advantage of this. Governments treat crises as an opportunity to change the social landscape to suit their agendas. Unheard of profits were amassed by companies like Halliburton, which George Bush Sr. and Dick Cheney were both former CEOs. That war was a gold rush for the elites. The winners of war write the history books, but the artists express how the people felt at the time. Hands Held High by Linkin Park was released in 2007, 6 years into the War on Terror.
Like this war's really just a different brand of war. Like it doesn't cater to rich and abandon poor.
Hindsight is always 20/20, and many Americans highly regret succumbing to the pressure put onto them by that crisis. Just like the Nazis, and the Americans did with past crises, the Canadian government has taken advantage of the COVID crisis to trample its citizens' rights.
Regardless of the fact that we are attacking your fundamental rights or limiting your fundamental rights, and the Charter says that's wrong, we're still going to go ahead and do with it. It's basically a loophole that allows a majority to override fundamental rights of a minority.
Instead of protecting you from the tyranny of the state, the Charter in this paragraph is now being used as a rationale and justification for why the state must come down and tell you what to do in order to protect your neighbors.
Crisis is the rationale for tyranny. Here in Ontario, lockdowns lasted longer than anywhere in Canada, and as time wore on, there were 3 common reactions. You either became a drunk, a chunk, or a hunk. In the face of tyranny, it is an easy pitfall to turn to booze or drugs as a means to distract. I grew up trusting authority figures, but now our government was using the same playbook as the Nazis, evoking emergency powers to restrict bank accounts, freedom of speech and assembly, and to arrest and detain political dissidents. They've introduced temporary measures, such as forced invasive medical testing, experimental gene-altering therapies, and digital passports.
It's probably just temporary, yeah.
If you complied with the measures, you got the carrot, which was being deputized a hero in their new normal.
You're a hero.
If you went against them, you got the stick, which was having your character attacked.
Because frankly, we know that we can't trust the unvaccinated.
Oh, you can't shame them. You can't call them stupid. You can't call them silly. Yes, they are.
It's the unvaccinated who are the threat.
Losing your right to work.
We don't know what the long-term side effects are.
It also hasn't been proven to be effective.
Your right to travel. Your right to liberty. Among other things. The government hates that they can't control us in every way. Whenever our safety appears to be in jeopardy, the government's solution is more control. Every time there is a crisis, it costs us our freedoms. So how is one supposed to react when their trust has been so badly broken? Many Canadians have disengaged. 38% of eligible voters didn't cast a ballot in the last Canadian election. Most people know more about their favorite public personalities than they do themselves, but it's not entirely all their fault. Even the ancient Roman elite knew keeping the people distracted from political and social issues was key to maintaining control. They built enormous amphitheaters to house spectacular battles they called gladiator games. Slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals were forced to fight to the death for the entertainment of the Roman Empire's citizens. It's tempting to get caught up in all the excitement.
Are you not entertained?
But in this day and age, when there's no short of distractions, awareness has emerged as a top valued currency. Technology is changing, but the idea of keeping the people distracted to maintain control remains the same. When you become aware of the tactics being used, it becomes more obvious, more difficult to catch you off guard. When you listen to the stories being read on the news and consider what the intended reaction is, it becomes clear how they want the viewer to feel. They do this every day, consistently, for a reason. If they had their way, we'd be in a constant state of fear, anxiety, and guilt. The urgency the crisis creates dictates how many people are willing to accept any loss of liberty.
Making other people sick, and really you're killing other people.
Do we believe what's being said, or do we question the narrative? As far back as the 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte said, 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
The media pushes the stories they do because it evokes a reaction. If it's incendiary enough, it becomes difficult to ignore.
Fear. Fear.
But never forget.
Fear. 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 Fear.
It's your reaction to everything that defines your fate.
Turn off the TV.
If you believed everything the legacy media claimed, then you likely welcomed the invasive mandates.
I love rules. No rules is chaos.
But most succumb to the fear-mongering and the social professional pressures.
We have to start doing things for the greater good of society, and not for idiots who think that they can do their own research.
We need to start looking at the choice to remain unvaccinated the same as we look at driving while intoxicated.
Every death that we are seeing from COVID could have been prevented.
Literally, the only people dying are the unvaccinated.
I'm sure everyone has experienced a person in their lives that enjoys boundary pushing.
And I won't take no for an answer.
The second you say yes to one thing, it becomes the new precedent. If you give an inch, they will take a mile. So please, dear viewer, when confronted with crisis and a strong reaction is being intentionally provoked, take pause. Ask yourself, what do they have to gain from my reaction? And what control over myself will I lose by giving it to them? Am I the scared zebra being separated from my herd? History shows, just like predators, governments take advantage during crises. When the rich wage war, it's the poor who die, and it's our reaction to their war that decides what happens to us. It's the reaction they need to take your power. Deny them. How you react during a crisis will either make you or break you. It doesn't matter if it's a war against fascism, a war against terror, or a war against a virus. It's still not too late to wake up that sleeping giant. Pressure is being applied for a reason. Why?
This is what I call the greatest asymmetric information gap in my financial career. That's how Wall Street makes money. 90% of the people don't know something, 10% do, and you trade against them and you make money.
Who stands to gain from this panic? And what do we stand to lose?
Right now, we have 10% of the population that knows what we know, and the other 90% doesn't, except this trade's deadly. And the longer it goes on, people aren't going to lose money, they're going to lose their health and their lives.
Before the next time a crisis rears its ugly head, remember, you have a choice to make. You can proactively prepare yourself not to react, or you can submit yourself to the mercy of your reflexes. The choice is yours. This has been Mitch Verigin for Druthers News.
Be who you want to be in freedom and joy.